The build possibilities in Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree are endless, but which build offers the most damage, survivability, and consistency? These are all the things we need to consider every time we make a new build for our character. Luckily for you guys, I took my 5 best Elden Ring builds for the DLC and compiled it into one video. Each build on this list provides a completely different playstyle, allowing you to choose exactly how you want to play. If you want to see more top 5 lists like this one each month, let me know in the comments below. We are really close to 100k subs, and I can't thank you guys enough. I hope you enjoy the video. The backhand blades are the most satisfying new weapons to use in Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. These blades are lightweight, they offer incredibly fast melee attacks, long combos, and come equipped with the blind spot Ash of War, which turns you into a true assassin, allowing you to quickly dash behind enemies. This dash is incredibly powerful because it dodges enemy attacks, deals piercing damage, and breaks the guard of any enemy using a shield. Quick shout out to our sponsor, Damn Mods. If you don't have time to grind for items or runes, Damn Mods will help you max out your character incredibly fast. This service works on all platforms, has a 5-star rating on Trustpilot, and can make your experience way more enjoyable. Don't forget to use my code COLDBOY at checkout for up to $100 off. This build is a must-have for any dexterity players out there who prefer quick and deadly melee attacks over the slower and more precise attacks that are typically required for strength-based builds. To make these blades even deadlier, I infuse them with the Blood Affinity, which adds over 100 blood loss buildup for each attack. The quick attacks from the backhand blades will allow you to stack blood loss incredibly fast, and the blind spot Ash of War is perfect for dealing quick damage and getting out of harm's way in the process. Stamina control is very important with this build. Even though these attacks can be executed in quick succession, you'll find yourself in trouble if you spam them too much. Luckily, Shadow of the Erdtree contains an upgraded version of the green turtle talisman from the base game. The 2-headed turtle talisman is crucial for this build because it greatly raises stamina recovery speed, which will allow you to attack again, or even dodge out of the way at the very last second before taking damage. With stamina control playing such a huge role in this build, you will benefit greatly from increasing your endurance over time. As you increase your endurance, your stamina bar will grow larger, and you will be able to wear heavier armor, which offers greater protection for your character. The best thing about this build is you can make it as soon as you start the DLC. The backhand blades and the Solitude armor that you see in the gameplay footage is obtainable near the very first site of grace in the Land of Shadow. Since the backhand blades weigh almost nothing, you're able to easily equip heavier armor, which increases your poise and defense. This is very important because it allows you to execute more combos without being interrupted. The backhand blades also have an impressive moveset. This includes light and heavy running attacks that provide incredible range in combat, very deadly jump attacks that mimic the attacks from dual-wielding curved swords or twin blades, and endless combos that allow you to seamlessly transition from dashing to attacking. These blades can easily carry you through the entire DLC and are easily one of the best dexterity weapons in the entire game. Your highest stats on this build will be Vigor, Endurance, and Dexterity. I currently have 60 Vigor on this build, and to be honest, I wouldn't go any lower than 50 for the DLC since the enemies hit very hard, especially with lower Erdtree blessings. 15 Mind is more than enough, since the blind spot Ash of War only requires 9 FP to execute. You'll need roughly 40 Endurance to wield the backhand blades and equip the Solitude armor without having to rely on any talismans to increase your equipment load before you get too heavy. I have 80 Dexterity to help me reach the maximum amount of damage, and keep in mind, if you decide to use this weapon with the Keen Affinity, you can achieve S tier scaling for Dexterity. And lastly, 39 Arcane. The further you increase Arcane, the more blood loss buildup you can achieve. I believe you only need 38 Arcane to reach 100 blood loss buildup, which is more than enough in my opinion. The main and only weapon on this build is a fully upgraded Blood Backhand Blade. Even though this is a singular weapon on paper, it actually turns into 2 blades when you two-hand the weapon. You can see here 481 physical attack power, B tier scaling for Dex, and D tier scaling for Arcane when using the Blood Affinity, and 100 blood loss buildup. The backhand blade can be found as soon as you start the DLC. From the Scorched Ruins Site of Grace, head north until you see a large coffin surrounded by Inquisitor enemies. The backhand blades can be found right beside the coffin and can easily be looted without fighting a single enemy. For the armor, I'm using the full Solitude set. This armor provides incredible defense for your character and gives you nearly 100 poise, which will allow you to execute more consecutive attacks without being interrupted. The armor can also be obtained as soon as you start the DLC, but will require you to kill the Blackgale Knight in the Western Nameless Mausoleum directly northwest from the Gravesite Plain Site of Grace. For talismans, I'm actually going to provide several options for you to choose from since the backhand blade is very versatile and can be improved in multiple ways. The first talisman combination I'm going to show you is the one I'm currently using. First, I have the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, which enormously boosts physical damage negation. This paired with the Solitude armor set will give you a massive amount of survivability. Next, one of the newer talismans in the game that can be found in the Land of Shadow, the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman. This is an upgraded version of the Green Turtle Talisman from the base game and provides even faster stamina recovery speed. The Two-Headed Turtle Talisman can be found near the Temple Town Ruins Site of Grace. If you head southeast and work your way down the gravestones on the edge of the cliff, and then head west once you reach the bottom, you'll eventually stumble across a cave beneath a waterfall that contains the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman. I'm also using the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, which greatly raises attack power with successive attacks. And lastly, the Lord of Blood's Exaltation, which increases your attack power by 20% for 20 seconds whenever blood loss is in the vicinity. The second talisman combination focuses heavily on boosting the damage of Blind Spot. We're still using the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman and the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman for better protection and stamina control, but the other two talismans have been replaced. The Shard of Alexander greatly boosts the attack power of skills, which adds roughly 15% extra damage to Blind Spot. Since Blind Spot is considered a piercing attack, you can also use the Spear Talisman, which will add an additional 15% to the weapon skill, giving you a total of 30% extra damage with Blind Spot. The last combination you could try includes the Shard of Alexander and the Spear Talisman, which stacks and adds 30% extra damage to Blind Spot. You also have the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, which raises attack power with successive attacks. And lastly, the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman, which slowly restores FP. This talisman is great because you don't have to rely on FP flasks to execute Blind Spot and can fully recharge your FP when outside of combat, for example. The Blessed Blue Dew Talisman can be found at the Church of Benediction, which is located southeast of the Cliff Road Terminus Site of Grace in the Gravesite Plains area. For my Wondrous Physic mix, I'm using the Dexterity Not Cracked tier, which adds plus 10 dexterity to your build, and the Thorny Crack tier, which increases your damage up to 20% for each successive hit. Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree is finally here, and it's brutal. Luckily for you guys, I created a build that's guaranteed to slap every enemy in the DLC. With this build, you'll be power stancing 2 Greatswords. Greatswords are my favorite weapon types in any Souls game because they are versatile and are capable of dealing a lot of poise damage to enemies. The added advantage you receive from power stancing 2 Greatswords includes higher DPS, more attacks in the same time frame, and the ability to proc status effects faster. In your right hand, you'll be using the Blasphemous Blade, easily one of the strongest weapons in the entire game, even after the nerfs. This greatsword has high physical attack power, fire damage, and the Taker's Flame Ash of War, which destroys every single enemy in the game. It can kill multiple targets at once, and heals you every time you deal damage. The healing effect is incredibly useful in the DLC since most of the enemies can take away about 75% of your health with a single hit. In your left hand, a Cold Iron Greatsword with the Chilling Mist Ash of War. This Ash of War adds roughly 127 Frost buildup while using the Cold Affinity. This means you can apply Frost buildup and deal fire damage simultaneously. After you apply enough Frost to your targets, they'll actually take 20% extra damage, and when you pair this with the fire damage from the Blasphemous Blade, you'll find it incredibly easy to kill enemies fast. This combination is great because it doesn't limit you to one specific status effect. If you're ever fighting an enemy who is resistant to fire, the frost damage will take them out easily. The same principle also applies with the cold iron greatsword. If you're fighting enemies who are resistant to frost, chances are the fire damage from the blasphemous blade will give you the upper hand in battle. Now, you may have already noticed this from the gameplay, but jump attacks play a huge role in the effectiveness of this build. Thanks to the Raptor's Black Feathers chest armor and the Claw Talisman on the build, you'll be stacking 25% extra damage to your jump attacks. This combination is very deadly when you power stance greatswords and deals a lot of poise damage to enemies, opening up more opportunities for critical strikes. In fact, this jump attack is so powerful that it's able to interrupt every single enemy's attack, which is basically increasing your survivability in the process. You're also free to apply any status effect or Ash of War you like to your greatsword, so essentially, this build can be used for every enemy and every single boss. At level 150, your stats will look something like this. 45 Vigor is really all you need, and to be honest, 60 to 70 Vigor isn't going to save you from being two-shotted in the DLC. With 45 Vigor, you'll be able to invest more of your level points into stats that increase your damage output, for example. This build also uses Margot's Great Rune, which compensates for the HP you are sacrificing. Next, 30 Mind. Some people might say that this is too much, but honestly, it just means you can spam Taker's Flame more often and even have FP left over after buffing your character, which can be helpful in the DLC since the enemies are very aggressive and barely give you enough time to even drink a flask. 20 Endurance is just enough for you to equip 2 greatswords, a seal, and the Black Feathers armor before reaching a heavy equipment load. Since the Blasphemous Blade scales with Strength and Faith, I increase my Strength to 40. This will give me more than enough damage for physical attacks for each of my greatswords, and with 62 Faith, I'm able to increase the fire damage for Taker's Flame. Since Faith is the highest stat on the build, you can be very flexible with the incantations you use. In my right hand, I have a fully upgraded Blasphemous Blade. This greatsword was just nerfed in the most recent update, and I can confidently say it is still one of the best weapons in the game. The damage is still there, but you won't be able to knock down enemies anymore, which doesn't really matter since the sword still staggers the enemies and interrupts their attacks. You can see here 434 physical attack power, 338 fire attack power, C tier scaling for strength, and B tier scaling for faith. In my left hand, a fully upgraded cold iron greatsword with the Chilling Mist Ash of War. This Ash of War can freeze almost any enemy as soon as you make contact, which makes it incredibly powerful. 423 physical attack power, 213 magic damage, B tier scaling for strength, and 127 frost buildup. The best sacred seal to use on this build is the Clawmark seal. This seal offers nearly 300 incantation scaling when fully upgraded, scales evenly with strength and faith, and will boost the damage of bestial incantations. The main incantations you need to use on this build are Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. Golden Vow increases your offense by 15% and your defense by 10%. Flame Grant Me Strength stacks on top of Golden Vow, giving you 20% physical and fire affinity attack power. Any other incantations you use will be personal preference, but if you want a solid recommendation, the Black Blade incantation is great for bosses since it applies a debuff to enemies and drains their health over time based on the amount of total HP they have. For the armor, I'm using the Black Knife Hood, the Raptor's Black Feathers, and the Page Trousers. The most important armor piece you need on this build is the Raptor's Black Feathers, which increase your jump attack damage by 10%. The first talisman I'm using is the Green Turtle Talisman, which boosts stamina recovery speed. This talisman is essential for landing jump attacks in quick succession. Next, the Claw Talisman, which enhances your jump attack damage by 15%, and yes, this stacks with the Raptor's Black Feathers, giving you a total of 25% extra jump attack damage on the build. I'm also using the Shard of Alexander, which greatly boosts the attack power of skills. This talisman will increase the damage of Taker's Flame and Chilling Mist. And lastly, the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, which enormously boosts physical damage negation. For my Wondrous Physic mix, I'm using the Flame Shrouding Crack tier, which boosts fire damage, and the Stone Barb Crack tier, which makes stance breaking even easier with your dual greatswords. This Fire Knight build harnesses the power of the Spear of the Impaler, a powerful weapon you can obtain from killing one of Shadow of the Erdtree's main bosses, Messmer the Impaler. Fire Knight build focuses primarily on increasing the effectiveness of Messmer's Assault, a new, unique weapon skill exclusive to the Spear of the Impaler, which unleashes a fierce succession of attacks using a flame-coated spear. Repeated inputs allow for up to 2 additional attacks and finishes the combo with a final move that thrusts the spear into the ground, causing countless spears to rise up and pierce your enemies. The first input is great for sweeping the area and burning all enemies in front of you. It also has decent range, allowing you to hit targets that are not directly within your reach. This is extremely helpful during boss fights or against enemies that are very deadly and require a bit of distance to stay out of harm's way. The second input unleashes a powerful flurry of stabs with your spear, and the final input deals AoE damage and is able to stagger or knock down most enemies. Not only is this weapon skill incredibly powerful, but it barely requires any FP to execute, which means you can spam it more often without having to rely on FP flasks or investing a high amount of level points into Mind, for example. In addition to this amazing weapon skill, the Spear of the Impaler has a unique heavy attack that allows you to throw your spear, dealing fire damage in the process. This heavy attack can be charged for more damage and can be executed while riding your horse, making Messmer's Spear one of the most versatile faith scaling weapons in the game. The damage of this throw can be increased with the right talismans as well. The armor you wear with this build can also increase your damage. The Winged Serpent helmet increases the damage of Fire Knight skills, adding 10% extra damage to Messmer's Assault. Surprisingly, Messmer's Assault is really effective against enemies who are resistant to fire damage, but doesn't quite deal enough poise damage to stagger enemies for critical strikes. I would recommend having at least 50 poise on your build just so you aren't constantly being interrupted or staggered when you're trying to execute the entire Messmer's Assault combo. But I will say this weapon is very strong, reliable, and works against every enemy in the game, making it one of the best boss weapons in Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. Your stats for this build will look something like this. You'll typically want your vigor to be at least 60 for this build because the protection is very low and the enemies in the DLC hit very hard. I do have 25 mind, but honestly this can be reduced to 20 since the Messmer's Assault weapon skill doesn't use much FP at all. I also have 25 endurance, so I can equip the Spear of the Impaler and the necessary armor to reach at least 50 poise. You'll need at least 14 strength and 35 dexterity to wield the spear, and since it scales the highest with dexterity, I increased my dex to 43 so I could add a bit more physical attack power. The highest stat on this build is faith at 80. The higher your faith, the more fire damage you will deal with Messmer's Assault. Your incantations will also do more damage as you increase faith over time, but you shouldn't have to go any higher than 80. The main weapon on this build is a fully upgraded Spear of the Impaler. This spear can only be obtained after killing Messmer and trading in his remembrance. This boss fight is tough, so I would recommend using anything you can to kill him. I used a dexterity-focused bleed build with one of Shadow of the Erdtree's new weapons, the Backhand blades. I actually have a whole video dedicated to this build, so if you want to see a complete breakdown including stats, armor, and which talismans to use, I'll put a link at the top of the screen right now. It seems like blood loss is the best tactic to use against Messmer. You can see here 342 physical attack power, 410 fire attack power, B tier scaling for dex, and C tier scaling for faith. In my left hand I have the Fire Knight seal. This seal is perfect for this build because it boosts the damage of Messmer's flame incantations. To get this seal, you will need to enter Shadowkeep from the eastern side. This will require you to travel through the Morth Ruins and Bonnie Village, and then past Rabbith Rise. When you first arrive in this area, you'll notice that it's completely flooded. This is the route you will need to take in order to drain the water and access the area that contains the Fire Knight seal. The main incantations on this build will be Golden Vow, which increases your offense by 15% and defense by 10%, Flame Grant Me Strength, which increases your physical and fire affinity attack power by 20%, and Fire Serpent, which is your main fire spell and benefits from the damage boost of the Fire Knight seal. These are the only incantations I use, but feel free to use any incantations you want, since you have 80 faith on the build. The first piece of armor I'm using is the Winged Serpent Helm, which enhances Fire Knight skills. This helmet will increase the damage of Mesmer's Assault by 10%. This helmet is dropped by one of the mini-bosses inside of Shadow's Keep right before the Mesmer boss fight. Next, I'm using the Fire Knight chest piece, which increases the damage of Mesmer's Flame incantations. This chest piece can be farmed by killing the Fire Knight enemies located inside of Shadow's Keep. The gloves and greaves are completely up to you, but just remember to reach at least 50 poise with your armor so you won't be interrupted while using Mesmer's Assault. The talismans I'm using focus heavily on increasing the effectiveness of Mesmer's Assault. First, I have the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, which enormously boosts physical damage negation. Next, the Shard of Alexander, which greatly boosts the attack power of skills, adding 15% extra damage to Mesmer's Assault. I'm also using the Fire Scorpion Charm, which increases fire damage by 12%. And lastly, the Axe Talisman, which increases the damage of your charged heavy throwing attacks by 10%. For my Wondrous Physic mix, I'm using the Flame Shrouding Crack Tier, which boosts the damage of your fire attacks, and the Spiked Crack Tier, which boosts the damage of your charged heavy throwing attacks. I have to be honest with you guys, this is probably one of the strongest strength builds you can make in Elden Ring right now. If you're looking for a weapon that's capable of taking down even the toughest bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree, then let me introduce you to the Blood Fiend's Arm Colossal Weapon. Colossal weapon attacks are slow and methodical, but can deal some big damage with the right timing. The Blood Fiend's Arm scales primarily with Strength and Arcane. Strength will increase your overall damage output, while Arcane increases your blood loss buildup after you apply a blood affinity. The Blood Fiend's Arm also gives you the freedom to apply any Ash of War you like, and for this build, we're going to be using Endure. This Ash of War decreases all the damage you take by nearly 50% and also increases your poise, allowing you to absorb more hits without being staggered or interrupted. If you apply the blood affinity with this Ash of War, you can achieve over 200 blood loss buildup per hit. Since blood loss will happen almost instantly, you can benefit greatly from using the Lord of Blood's Exaltation on this build. This powerful talisman increases your attack power by 20% for 20 seconds whenever blood loss is in the vicinity. Since charged heavy attacks play a huge role in the effectiveness of this build, the Axe Talisman is an absolute must-have since it increases the damage of your charged heavies by 10%. I'm also using the Rakshasa's Armor, which adds nearly 10% extra damage when all 4 pieces of armor are equipped. The playstyle for this build is very simple. Activate the Endure Ash of War so you can absorb as much damage as possible and increase your poise for 3 seconds, and then unleash as many charged heavy attacks as you can. You'll find yourself able to kill the toughest enemies incredibly fast, while also being able to take a substantial amount of damage before needing to drink an HP flask. I did an entire playthrough using this build, and I can confidently say it was one of the easiest playthroughs I've had so far. Even easier than the double Greatsword jump attack strength build that I posted about a week ago. I think this build is perfect for any player that wants to deal the maximum amount of damage without having to worry about dodging or getting your attacks interrupted. Your stats for this build should look something like this. Ideally, you would want 60 vigor on the build for the most optimal amount of HP, but you can get away with 50 if you want to invest more of your level points into Strength or Arcane, for example. I have 15 Mind, which is more than enough to use your Ash of War consistently and summon a Mimic tier if you need it. 35 Endurance is just enough for you to equip the Blood Fiend's Arm, a Seal, the Armor, and all 4 talismans before reaching a heavy equipment load. I have 60 Strength, which is the soft cap for physical attack power, 25 Faith, so I can cast Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength, and 55 Arcane, which allows you to achieve over 200 blood loss buildup with the Blood Affinity. The main weapon on this build is a fully upgraded Blood Fiend's Arm using the Endure Ash of War with the Blood Affinity. This Ash of War actually comes with this weapon, and when activated, absorbs enemy damage and increases your poise so you can deal consecutive heavy attacks without being interrupted. This Ash of War is crucial for this build to be effective. You can see here nearly 700 physical attack power, C tier scaling for strength, B tier scaling for arcane, and 212 blood loss buildup per attack. This weapon can be farmed by killing the Blood Fiend enemies, which you'll find scattered all across the map in the DLC. If you want the best place to farm these enemies, I would go to the Prospect Town. In my left hand, I have a basic finger seal that I use to cast the 2 incantations on this build. Golden Vow increases your offense by 15% and your defense by 10%, and Flame Grant Me Strength increases your physical and fire affinity attack power by an additional 20%. Activating these 2 incantations before any difficult fight will turn you into a killing machine. For the armor, I'm using the full Rakshasa set. This armor set is perfect for this build because each piece adds roughly 2% extra damage to the build, giving you a total of 8% extra damage when all pieces are equipped. 8% might not seem like a lot, but when you factor in the extra damage from your incantations and talismans, it's well worth it. To get this armor, you will need to kill the Rakshasa mini-boss located in the Eastern Nameless Mausoleum. The first talisman I'm using on this build is the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, which enormously boosts physical damage negation. This talisman is crucial for survivability during your charged heavy attacks. Next, the Two-Handed Sword Talisman, which increases the damage of two-handed weapons by 15%. This is a new talisman that was introduced with the DLC and can be found at the highest point of the Temple Town ruins inside of a chest after killing one of the Horned Warrior enemies. I'm also using the Lord of Blood's Exaltation, which increases your attack power by 20% for 20 seconds whenever blood loss is in the vicinity. And lastly, the Axe Talisman, which increases the damage of your charged heavy attacks by 15%. The damage potential of this build is actually quite insane once you factor in all of the extra damage you're getting from your incantations, armor, and talismans. For my Wondrous Physic mix, I'm using the Opaline Hard tier, which boosts all damage negation, stacking on top of Endure and the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. And I'm also using the Spiked Crack tier, which boosts the damage of your charged heavy attacks even further. Have you ever wanted to create an indestructible build that can absorb all damage, maximize your survivability, and provide a way for you to deal damage while blocking? For starters, let's talk about the best shield to use in Elden Ring, which is the Fingerprint Shield. This shield provides the most physical and non-physical damage protection compared to any other shield in the game, and can also be infused with an Ash of War. With this shield providing the most amount of protection, it's also the heaviest shield in the game, which means endurance is more important than ever if you want to be efficient with this build. Typically, the larger your stamina bar is, the more attacks you will be able to absorb. Endurance also controls your equipment load, allowing you to carry more weight before reaching a heavy equipment load. Thanks to the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman, which greatly boosts stamina recovery speed, you'll be able to regenerate your stamina bar incredibly fast, allowing you to continue blocking almost immediately after getting your stamina bar depleted. This shield also has the highest guard boost value in the game, which can be further maximized with the right talisman and spell. The Pearl Shield Talisman is a new talisman from the DLC, which reduces the damage you take from non-physical damage by 20%. This is incredibly useful when you're going up against enemies who deal fire damage, holy damage, and even lightning damage, for example. It also decreases magic damage by 20%, making it one of the best in slot talismans for a tank build. To enhance your defense even further, you'll be using the Scholar's Shield spell, which boosts your guarded damage negation by nearly 30% and your guarded magic damage protection by 70%, making it very useful against sorcerers or bosses that deal magic damage. Obviously, this build won't be very efficient without a good source of damage, which is why I recommend any type of thrusting weapon like a spear or great spear. This weapon type allows you to attack while blocking, which makes it the best weapon choice for a shield build. I chose the pike because it has the longest reach out of any weapon in the entire game. It may not provide the most damage, but the extended reach will make you feel way more efficient during combat. One of the easiest ways to add more damage to this build is to add the Seppuku Ash of War and the the Lord of Blood's Exaltation Talisman. Seppuku adds 30 flat physical attack power to your weapon and 30 base blood loss buildup, which stacks with Arcane. Every time you activate this Ash of War, the Lord of Blood's Exaltation Talisman will increase your physical attack power by 20% for 20 seconds whenever blood loss is in the vicinity. If you want to buff your physical attack power by 20% and deal 10% more stance damage to enemies, you could also use the Cragblade Ash of War. This build is very flexible, allowing you to swap talismans and Ashes of War freely without having to sacrifice any survivability at all. Your stats will fluctuate depending on what type of Ash of War or affinity you decide to use, but for a bleed-focused setup like mine, your stats will look something like this. To be honest, you can get away with 45 to 50 Vigor simply because you won't be taking too much damage at all if you play carefully and keep your stamina in control. Mind does not need to be increased whatsoever because you will already have more than enough to cast Scholar's Shield and your Ash of War. Endurance is going to be your highest stat since the Fingerprint Shield is heavy, and with a larger stamina bar, you can absorb more attacks before an enemy can break your stance. You will need at least 48 strength to wield the Fingerprint Shield, and since the blood affinity scales with strength, dexterity, and arcane, I increased strength to 53, dexterity to 40, and arcane to 30 to help increase blood loss buildup. Just remember, you do need at least 12 intelligence to cast Scholar's Shield. The main melee weapon on this build is a fully upgraded blood pike with the Seppuku Ash of War. This spear actually has the longest reach out of every single weapon in the entire game. You can see here 481 physical attack power, C tier scaling for strength, D tier scaling for dex and arcane, with 91 blood loss buildup. You will also need a glintstone staff so you can cast Scholar's Shield. You can use any glintstone staff you want without having to worry about meeting the stat requirements. I would recommend, however, using the lightest staff you have in your inventory. The best shield to use for this build is the Fingerprint Stone Shield. This shield provides 100% physical guarded damage negation with nearly 80% damage negation for magic, fire, lightning, and holy damage with an 86 guard boost once fully upgraded. For the armor, you can pretty much use anything you like before reaching a heavy equipment load. I'm using the Altered Banished Knight's helmet, the Altered Banished Knight chest piece, the Scaled Gauntlets, and Scaled Greaves. The talismans for this build can be swapped out depending on your playstyle. The first one I'm using is the Pearl Shield Talisman. This talisman reduces the damage you take from non-physical damage by 20%. This is incredibly useful when you're going up against enemies who deal fire damage, holy damage, and pretty much any other elemental attack you can think of. Next, the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman, which greatly boosts stamina recovery speed. This talisman is crucial for this build if you don't want to risk taking damage after getting your stance broken. With this talisman, your stamina bar will recover incredibly fast, making you more efficient during combat. Since you'll be making enemies bleed, the Lord of Blood's Exaltation is a must-have for this setup. This talisman increases your attack power by 20% for 20 seconds whenever blood loss is in the vicinity. The fourth talisman will change depending on the enemies you're fighting. You can include talismans that increase your resistance to specific elements during boss fights, for example, or maybe even use the Godskin Swaddling Cloth, which restores HP with each successive hit. For the Wondrous Physic mix, I'm using the Green Burst Crystal tier, which further enhances stamina recovery speed on the build, and the Strength Knot Crystal tier, which boosts strength by 10 level points, giving you even more physical attack power.